weapons that I dealt with some years ago that finally was developed and that was put to rest was an energy weapon, basically a microwave. You might be familiar with it. And it was very effective, very cool weapon, except the problem is that you know what microwaves do, right? How it heats things up? Well, when you point it at a human being, it does the same thing. It boils the water underneath the skin, which is a very uncomfortable process. It had some very good, quote good, I put in quotations, uses, except that it violated everything that we could think of in terms of law, ethics, and morality, and was scrapped. The downside, of course, is you can go online and find this weapon, by the way, YouTube demonstrations, is now that our others, including potentially our enemies, know that this weapon exists and can, by not perfect reverse engineering, figure out how to produce the weapon, even if we don't use it. So one of my calls in our conversation was to bring in the questions of law, ethics, and morality very early, as we used to joke when we're sitting at the, in the pub drawing out the possible weapon system on the napkin. That's where you need to have the lens rather than waiting at the end piece of the whole thing. I also ought to say I've been doing a lot of work for many years on the law of war issue. My wife, Tamara Pearson Destray, is the Henry Luce Professor of Conflict Resolution at the Corbell School, and she does intractable inter-ethnic conflict. And we often joke that if she doesn't do her job right, it's me who gets stuck trying to figure out to pick up the pieces, because if the conflict goes awry and the resolution doesn't come about, then one of the issues is the Clausewitz sensibility that, I will butcher, of course, the actual statement, but warfare is basically an extenuation of politics and of diplomacy. It's the end piece. Some of you would say, and I would say too, that you could say it is a failure of diplomacy, but it's certainly part and parcel of the political process, not a separate piece of the political process. Before coming back to Colorado, I was also at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C. as a federal prosecutor. And so I come to Colorado, to Corbell, to the University of Denver with a kind of a mixed baggage of background and interests looking at these issues. When I think about IHL, I am reminded that it's actually the oldest form of modern human rights law. We now have something called international human rights, but the compilation that we put together finally in the modern day form of the Geneva Conventions, the 1977 protocols, and the variety of conventions and treaties that deal with biological weapons or chemical weapons or anti-personnel mines, landmines, and those kinds of issues, are actually the core, the origins of what we think of modern human rights law. Now, IHL is now thought of as a subset of that larger scheme, but it is, quite frankly, it's astounding the amount of literature that has been produced over the centuries, and certainly since the 1940s, that govern this interesting issue. Because now we're dealing with a whole set of rules in the just war theory, which is I'm a student of, and we're looking at the second part of it, the jus in bello, which is to say the rules that govern warfare. We're interesting as human beings, which is to say at the point when we've thrown out all the rules, when we are acting at our worst, when we are being barbaric with each other and slaughtering each other, we still insist that there have to be rules that govern even that behavior. I actually think that's a good thing, folks. It is the light at the end of the tunnel, perhaps. It is a spark and a reminder of our humanity that even in this worst of behavior, there are rules that govern, right? And I take some hope in that process. It's not true that there are no rules in love and war. There are, right? It is important that we become aware of them, that you become aware of them. And what happens in the Geneva Conventions, in the beginnings of the Geneva Conventions, one of the first things it tells us is that having been signed and ratified and agreed upon by any country, it's our job to inform not just the military, not just the cadets, not just our flag officers and our senior officers, but the entire public, the civilian public. So it should not be possible when a President of the United States stands up and says about a particular armed conflict that the Geneva Conventions do not apply, and everybody out there goes, oh, he must be right, he knows, he's the commander-in-chief. And it shouldn't be just a handful of us who go, hold on, wait a minute, we know better, right? because you all are supposed to know the Geneva Conventions just as well as some of us out here should know the Geneva Conventions and what are the rules of warfare. By the way, that is your responsibility, not just my responsibility, not just the responsibility of the military to know those. Secondly, I have to say that it is my opinion, and after years of working with the military, that my military colleagues seem to be far more familiar with their constitutional duties and an understanding of IHL than anybody who seems to have been occupying the White House in the last several administrations. That's problematic, right? Because when you're in uniform, you can argue all the way up to the point until you're given the order, right? And at that point, there's no more arguments, right? And I can tell you that my colleagues in the military, senior officers, have had lots of disagreements and arguments up to a point. When William Taft III was the senior legal advisor in the State Department, he wrote copious memos arguing with Mr. Cheney, especially Mr. Cheney and Mr. Bush, and then in recent years, Mr. Coe advising Mr. Obama, because quite frankly, it's Mr. Obama who's used drones far more than Mr. Bush ever got around to. They've been advising for a long time about the fact that we ought to be following the Geneva Conventions, and unlike what Mr. Yu might have said, they are not quaint, right? They are applicable to this day. We first used them as a weapon in February 2002 to go after our public enemy number one, which was state number one for a very long time, which was Osama bin Laden when he was in the Pakistan province in Afghanistan. So we used weaponized drones going back to that point. In 2012, the global market for drones was $6 billion. 50 countries have acquired or are in the process of acquiring drones, and 27 countries are developing weaponized versions of drones on their own, not buying from us, but on their own. This is clearly a Pandora that has gotten out of its box, without a doubt. In Pakistan, if you look at the use of drones in 2004, one drone was used. In 2008, 35 drones were used. In 2012, 2010, 117 drones were used. In Yemen, between 2002 to 2008, only one weaponized drone was used. In 2009, only two. And then all of a sudden, in 2012, 42, and the numbers have continued to mostly increase until very recently. I think actually, by the way, there's a good sign in the fact that drone warfare is being taken out of the hands of the CIA and being turned over to the Department of Defense. I think that's a very good sign. I think you'll see much more restrictive use. There's much more sense of credibility going on. There is no such thing as an unlawful enemy combatant. That is in the imagination, the fervent imagination of the United States. You're either a combatant or you're a civilian. If you are a combatant, you have lots of rights and responsibilities, including the right to be able to commit homicide without any legal effect, which is, whereas a civilian has no right to take up arms even against an invading army. So the concept, so we have those two categories. The United States says this was a part of an experts meeting with the ICRC. It was never meant for the public to find out, but of course they do, and of course the United States leapt on that and has been able to take these folks who are clearly civilians, in my mind, and refer to them as operating in a continuous combat function. We can get into that with a Q&A, perhaps, and then be able to target them. Okay. We talked a little bit about fully autonomous drones, which are presently only prohibited by Department of Defense directive. I am told that, in fact, we do have the capacity already to have fully autonomous drones, but we are required now to have someone still at the trigger. But I don't think we're very, well, we know we have them already. I don't think it's very far in the future that we will have a fully capacity to have fully autonomous drones, right? Which is to say a drone is sitting up there for 30 or 60 days. It runs the scenery through the scenes it's picking up through its algorithms, makes its own decision as to who constitutes being a terrorist. By the way, terrorist is not a legal term, it's a political term. Terrorist act is a legal term, that's different. And then can fire its missiles or whatever it chooses to do with no one, quote, responsible, which is a deep concern for anyone, not just you folks, and it would be a deep concern of anyone in the military that there's nobody on the trigger, nobody potentially responsible. So in terms of U.S. legality, I'm almost finished here, I'm concerned about the president's kill list, right? You know, it came to light mostly for us in the al-Awlaki killing. Himself, who was a naturalized U.S. citizen, a week later, his Denver-born U.S. son who was killed by drones. I think that's a red herring. All of a sudden we got concerned because it was a U.S. citizen. I'm sorry, folks. That doesn't matter very much to me. The very fact is, I mean, I'm concerned about al-Awlaki and well, less with al-Awlaki. I mean, he's not a particularly sympathetic character, but clearly concerned about his son, right, who was basically at a campfire celebrating with his friends his return back to the United States. At least that's one of the stories that has come out of that. My deep concern is that this kill list has no due process. There is not even so much as a federal grand jury indictment that is going along with this. My colleague and friend Gary Solis, a retired colonel who wrote my favorite textbook on the topic, who was a former professor at West Point, he and I sat for 4 hours at the American Red Cross cafeteria in Washington trying to come up with some kind of way in which you could put together a legal kill list. We went through every permutation to representatives from the Supreme Court, all these other kinds of stuff, and we finished our 4-hour exercise and we looked at it and went, the problem is none of this is legal, right? And so what we have here is a president, Bush or Obama, engaging in extrajudicial killing. It doesn't matter whether the person is a U.S. citizen or a non-U.S. citizen. Finally, we refer to passing that there is a memo on this. An OLC, Office of Legal Counsel, the lawyers, the elite lawyers. This is the same group who brought you the torture memo, the Biden torture memo. So we have no access to this legal memorandum that supposedly gives the President of the United States the legal ability to use drones in the manner he has done so. It's secret. I don't know what to do with a secret legal memo, right? As a lawyer, as a professor of law, as an ethicist, I, of course, become immediately suspicious. And if you want to see something that unites both sides of the aisles, Republicans and Democrats, the fact that this memo stays secret is a concern on both sides. Finally, the effect on terrorism. Here's the problem. Leadership gets replaced, and the process at a 50-to-1 on average now that we know, 50-to-1 collateral damage. For every target that we hit, 50 innocents die. Okay? Is that an acceptable collateral rate? We can talk about collateral damage and how that works and how that works within the law. But here's the issue. When we target these folks who are fairly secretive in their movements, but they only come out usually in public for 2 events. Anybody want to figure out or guess what these 2 major events they come out for so that we can target them? Weddings and funerals. There's a good place to strike, right, so that you get your target, but you will kill the entire wedding party, or you kill everybody who's come to the funeral. So we wind up killing our person on our kill list, the known terrorist, whatever you may think of the legal process that we got to that, which is shaky at best. We have just made, lifelong enemies of everyone there who has survived the attack. I don't think we have accomplished anything, right? So again, I don't have a problem with drones as a weapons system. You might, I don't. I have significant problems in the way that it is presently being used, and unfortunately what I think the future may bring for us in the use of drones. Thanks.